Thank you very much for having me, guys. Thank you so much for organizing, and thank you to the sponsors. It's my first time in Prague, as we've heard. It's interesting being attacked by an American that, Trump. Sorry, I get a bit nervous. So the title of my talk is A Survivor's Tale. It's a little bit of a lie. I haven't yet survived. It may yet claim me. I'm still in the process of doing it. However, I thought it was a really good kind of case study for thinking about how we migrate from one piece of technology to something which is radically different. So just really quickly, who am I? I'm the front-end lead at a company called Avocet. We make a real-time online advertising buying tool. We have a lot of different microservices in Golang, and they're stitched together, and our clients interact with it via a large Angular app. I'm on the ESLint core team. Any ESLint users in the house? Yes. I thought that might make me more popular than the Angular stuff, so that's good. And the main thing I focus on with ESLint is the TypeScript parser. So some of you might not be aware that we actually support TypeScript with ESLint. So if you're using TypeScript, TSLint is not your only option. And that's a really interesting project for me. I love using TypeScript. I'm a contributor on Ultimate Angular. I'm representing with my swag here. I work with my buddy Todd Motto on producing Angular and TypeScript video courses. So if you're interested in learning Angular or learning TypeScript, please just check us out. And that's my Twitter. Please follow me. I need followers. So thinking about huge migrations, I think there's an awful lot of daunting aspects to moving between any large piece of software and another. AngularJS to Angular 2, you get trapped in the language. So AngularJS is what we officially have to call Angular version 1, and Angular is what we officially have to call Angular version 2 and above. I will slip in and out of calling them Angular 1, Angular 2, AngularJS, Angular. I apologize in advance for that, but if we're talking about AngularJS, we're talking about that very first version which came out in 2010. How many people have used Angular in any form? Cool. And has anybody made the switch from AngularJS to Angular 2 before? A couple of people. Cool. It's a good audience, I think. So I think the main thing is, as this journey has been progressing over the last 3 years, as the framework has been completely rewritten from scratch, it's okay not to have all the answers. The core team that write the framework don't have all the answers either. And migration paths are something that evolve over time through real-world users feeding back to the core team exactly what their experiences have been. And I think what I'd like to focus on today is how do we go about finding the right approach, not dealing with the minutiae? How do we find the broad themes that will help us with migrating? And that's something I'm currently going through. And hopefully, even if you're not planning on using Angular or migrating from one or the other, hopefully you can take something away from this and think about how it might fit in with your own development. So just really briefly, so we're all on the same page, AngularJS was created in 2010. It was kind of HTML enhanced. So adding superpowers is how they described it to your HTML attributes. You would create directives. And essentially, it left enough of the web platform in there so that designers and people using CSS could recognize it all and work with it. However, it gave JavaScript people the power to add new capabilities to existing DOM nodes. And it introduced the magical two-way data binding, which was this thing which blew all of our minds, that we could type into an input box and it would update in real time on the page. And later, the other side of that coin, it became one of the worst nightmares imaginable to manage in any kind of large-scale application, because you have no assurances as to where your data has changed. If you change something on this part of your application, it could mutate some state over in this part, and it's very, very hard to trace. So 2010, when Angular came out, it was a bit of a Wild West, and this is, I'm pretty sure, what I looked like in 2010. So we didn't have any modules, we didn't have any web components or any kind of idea of component hierarchies, no built-in APIs like promises for dealing with asynchrony, and JavaScript testing, not so much. That wasn't really a thing. So Angular was a solution to a lot of these problems. Angular came up with its own solution for modules. This was just a namespace for certain services to group them together and give them a name. Didn't really do very much. Custom directives gave us the ability to craft our own components. Even though we didn't really use the vernacular of components at the time, we built our own components and we structured applications through smaller pieces with custom HTML tags. We didn't have promises, so Angular created a layer for promises. They created the $Q service, and this was something that started out very custom, a bit like jQuery deferreds, and as the promise spec evolved in the background, it quickly aligned with that spec. And testing, Karma and Protractor are two tools that the Angular team made, or involved in making at least, and they really wanted everything to be testable. Dependency injection is a bit of a complicated way of expressing a very simple idea, but essentially being able to mock the actual dependencies of any particular part of your code meant that Angular was very, very testable out of the box. So we used these newfound capabilities to build massive JavaScript apps. And this is where we started to see some of the fragilities of the framework. In 2012, 2015, the TC39, which is the committee that governs JavaScript effectively and comes up with the new features and produces the spec, they were making up for lost time producing new features. Transpilers came about, so we had Tracer and then 6 to 5, which became Babel. And we were taking these new ideas and converting them down into usable code. So we've all kind of got used to this, having build processes, all that kind of stuff. And the best practice of having a kind of one-way data flow through your application and being able to predict how state is changed, and the component model became much more popular through frameworks like React, making it mainstream. So we all got JavaScript fatigue, and it became incredibly difficult to keep up with all of these different moving parts. As Martin was touching on, unfortunately, what this leads to is a kind of gang warfare mentality where, because we're all a bit scared on the inside, we feel like we need to join a club. We need to surround ourselves with people who are like-minded and will protect us against some of these insecurities that we have and some of the difficulties of dealing with all these different tools. Unfortunately, that inevitably leads to, if my way is the right way, your way must be the wrong way. And I think in our ecosystem, perhaps more than a lot of others, there are so many correct ways to do something, even if they're very different. Get out. So AngularJS was to the rescue of the kind of problems of things lacking in JavaScript. Angular 2+ is coming to the rescue of this kind of fragmented ecosystem. It's trying to position itself as being your best friend for development. It wants to be your platform that you develop on top of. A lot of tools make a decision to kind of provide you the minimal possible stuff, and then you layer on what you need. Angular has decided to go the other route. It's decided to provide you everything you would need for an application. Routing, animations, forms, testing, anything, you name it, it's got it out of the box. And it wants to do different environments like server-side rendering, mobile app development, those kind of things. It's trying to fulfill the promise of learn once, or kind of write once, run everywhere. We've realized that doesn't really work. So learn once, apply everywhere is the concept. So I don't want to waste too much more time talking about Angular. Specifically, I want to talk about what it's like to move between the two. Ahead of time compilation, it just happens to be one of my favorite features of Angular 2, so it's something to look up if you haven't heard of that before. And one thing I really liked along that message of kind of Devs United is power through partnership. So when we see these badges of these different JavaScript tools, what we're actually seeing is these logos behind them. And to see these big companies collaborating on different things. So Angular has a React native renderer, so the Angular team and the React team meet up regularly to discuss things. Obviously, the TypeScript from Microsoft and Google Angular relationship is fairly well known now. So let's talk about the main theory of this talk. I absolutely love this image. It's one of my favorite things. It's nothing like a good pun. So I think one of the key things we forget, because there's so many moving parts and there's so many things to think about all the time. Am I using the right tools? Am I writing my code in the right way? Am I structuring things correctly? We get stuck in the weeds, so to speak. We get stuck in the tiny bits of code that we deal with, and we forget our place in the world. We're not just the techies. We are stakeholders in our businesses, and any decisions we make on a daily basis affect our businesses. Ultimately, we're trying to build apps to empower our users. Our users might be internal to our company, but they might be client-facing. We still have a role to play in our businesses. The decisions we make might be cultural, they might be financial, but they do affect things. And so what I want to talk about today really helps connect you with the business side of things, I think. Identifying and implementing high-level patterns early on can be the difference between an incremental refactor and a total rewrite. This is really well illustrated by AngularJS to Angular 2, in my opinion. So when you start thinking about things in terms of high-level patterns, rather than getting lost in the change log, which I think was really easy to do earlier on, we were focusing on, okay, that stays the same, but that's different, and you're just kind of tracking changes between them rather than thinking about conceptual changes. And your boss or your manager or your product manager or your leader, your team lead, whatever the corporate structure is, they're probably not thinking like that. They have their own fears and their own concerns about what matters to them. And often the overlap of our fears and their fears will be very small, and we won't actually get good visibility into the other one's point of view. If we start thinking about things in very high-level topics, if we start trying to see things further down the road and think about how we can gradually make changes today to work towards them, that's something that becomes really easy to communicate to managers because they like to think in terms of time involvement and time commitment. So effectively, you can make your managers smarter. They will feel empowered in the situation because a lot of the time, they might actually be trying to cover up some insecurities that they don't actually understand what you're talking about very well. And it might not be something that they feel they can open up about. If you take the time to try and put yourself in their shoes and think about there's this scary migration coming up, all they're going to hear is, money, time. If you can try and think about it from that perspective, that will help you and it will help them. This can lead to a kind of a positive cycle of empathy and more productive meetings because you're both talking about things in the same language. Essentially, from a technical point of view, we're wanting to decide how do we get from A to B. And there's a couple of different things involved in that. It's not about getting lost in the changelog. It's more about thinking, okay, so what are the differences in environments? What are the differences in tooling? So with Angular, obviously, we're talking about a complete rewrite, and we're talking about a completely different tool set that they've decided to use. In 2010, when we didn't have all of those features, it was a completely different world. It was written for a different use case. The Angular team took the chance to rewrite it from scratch. So we have to rethink about the environment that we're setting up our application in. We don't have to think about, okay, it's not .component anymore, it's a decorator at component sign. Those kind of API changes, they're subject to change all the time, and they're not that important. It gets really interesting when you start thinking, can the best practices of B be backported to A? So with Angular 2, we are actually using a kind of component model where we have bindings and events being propagated, and we're managing things through one-way data flow. This is radically different to Angular 1. But does that mean it's impossible to write an Angular 1 app with one-way data flow? No, it isn't. If you think about it and you try and structure your Angular app to promote one-way data use, even though it isn't the default and it doesn't make it particularly easy for you, it can reap great rewards in terms of changing the team's mentality towards writing the application and being ready for when B arrives. So in other words, what can we make common between the two scenarios? There will be some things it's impossible to reconcile. Some things are just radically different, but there are lots and lots of things that we can actually make the same. So let's apply those ideas to an Angular migration. Environment and tooling. One of the big problems with the Angular team trying to come up with a migration path is every Angular 1 app is different. I don't know if you've seen lots of different implementations of Angular 1, but because everything was fairly loose and not very prescriptive, Angular 1 apps can look entirely different from one another. So it's very hard to know everyone's starting point. If we take the extreme, some people might have just a script tag on the page loading Angular. They bind the application through some directive attributes, and then they just have a little bit of JavaScript which kind of adds some functionality to the page. Other people might well have a fully fledged build process and have Webpack and all that kind of stuff already. But fundamentally, anybody could say, with Angular 2, we have to have a build process. So if we don't have one already in Angular 1, let's add a build process. That would be a huge step forward for an application along the migration path, and it hasn't required any new input from Angular 2. It hasn't required any new learnings from that, and it's something which is very easy to quantify how long it would take to set up as a project. So it's something that we can talk to our managers about and get it done. We also know that Angular 2 is written in TypeScript. So for example, in my application, it certainly wasn't always written in TypeScript, and there was a point where I was really starting to enjoy using TypeScript, messing around with it in my free time. I was really getting into it, and it was becoming clear that Angular 2 was going to be written in TypeScript. So taking the time to add TypeScript as a tool to my JavaScript code from my Angular 1 app reaped huge rewards. I got the comfort of knowing I was now using the environment and the tooling of the thing I wanted to migrate to further down the line, and I got all the benefits of using it today in terms of its type checking and its protection against various things. We can also think about best practices. So dumb components, as they're sometimes known, presentational components, we can do those in Angular 1. It's just that wasn't how we did them originally. We can write Angular 1 components which take in all of their inputs, all of their data via inputs, and send out nothing but events, and they don't mutate global state or anything like that. We can do that. So let's think about how we can refactor our code gradually now to employ those best practices, and suddenly, when you compare the differences between them, they don't seem so great. From an architecture point of view, you can go a step further. If you've managed to introduce TypeScript into your code, which, thanks to advances in TypeScript, is becoming easier and easier and easier, you can enable it on a JavaScript code base these days. You don't have to change extensions to .ts or anything like that. If you've got TypeScript in, you can start using tools like ngMetadata, written by Mr. Martin Hottel over there. And it's a wonderful library which gives you the syntactic sugar on top of Angular 1 so that it looks like Angular 2 code. So you can literally use the decorators at components and write your Angular 1 code using the same syntax as your Angular 2 code. And then the transformation becomes trivial. It is not magic. It's not doing hacks on top of Angular 1 to turn it into Angular 2, but it means that conceptually, you know you're getting your app ready for when it comes to migrate. And then finally, the kind of last step would be the tooling that does now exist from the Angular team is called Angular Upgrade, and it allows you to actually run an Angular 2 app, and then technically an Angular 1 app runs inside it. So you wrap your Angular 1 code in an Angular 2 app, and it kind of handles running the digest cycle for you and stuff like that. So it is possible to mix and match different things. And I would say this is an unusual case. If we try and imagine the idea of this talk for any other piece of software, if you're moving from one major version to another major version, it's unlikely that such a tool like Angular Upgrade would exist where you run the two at exactly the same time. But it is lucky that with Angular, we do have that available to us. So just a little bit of code as an example that I was talking about. You could well have an Angular 1 app. I'm sorry, that's not very big. You could well have an Angular 1 app which just had a script tag which pointed at AngularJS, and you started your application with the ngapp directive. That could be a way of bootstrapping an Angular 1 application. In Angular 2, you have to manually bootstrap. You have to call a bootstrap function to get your app started. But we can do that in Angular 1 as well. We can choose to do that. So this is the exact same application. This would work in exactly the same way, but we've introduced a build process which will take our ES 2015 modules and turn them into code which the browser can run, and we've manually bootstrapped our app instead of bootstrapping it in the DOM using a directive. So these are small changes that we can make which have radically changed how close our code is conceptually to the thing we want to migrate to. If we think about components, and even this might be taking a step too far because the .component helper only came about in Angular 1.5, there might be much older apps than that which don't have that available. You might be binding controllers directly. But if you imagine you have this Angular code and you've written it in components and you're kind of happy with your component structure of your app, you can introduce tooling and TypeScript like ngMetadata, and suddenly that exact same foo component can be written like this, and it's almost identical to Angular 2 now. we would just change our import to @Angular/core, and we would just get rid of our $controller reference because the place property is automatically scoped to the component it lives in. That is all you would need to do to change that component to an Angular 2 component. So there are no one-size-fits-all solutions, and it's really up to us to decide how we can move our app forward and closer towards our migration target. But I think there are lots and lots of different ways we can do it. It's always going to depend on the size of your team and your application complexity as to how worthwhile any of these intermediary changes are going to be. If you have a big team and lots of resources, it might actually be worth your while to sit down and rewrite a whole section of your app in one go. I, for example, was working on a large app by myself, and so I'd never had the option of rewriting very much at all. I would refactor as I went. And so for a long time, I had a mix of all of these styles that you've seen on the screen. I had classic Angular code, which was using the VM alias for this, and I was binding to that, and I had ng metadata wrapped components, and I also have Angular upgraded and downgraded providers and services. So the key message again, identifying and implementing high-level patterns early can make that difference between refactoring and rewriting. Deek.